All right, welcome. Have you ever really thought about what connects a cold beer, a fresh loaf of sourdough, and a great piece of cheese? Well, today, we're going to dive into the delicious science hidden inside these foods. It's an amazing story about humanity's oldest partnership with a world we can't even see. So let's just start with that question. Picture it, a crisp beer, a warm, crusty piece of bread, a slice of sharp cheddar. Now, besides being key ingredients for a perfect lunch, what's the surprising scientific thread that weaves them all together?
You know, the answer goes way deeper than just the fact that they taste great. All of these foods, and so many others, are the direct result of an ancient biological process. It's a kind of biotechnology our ancestors mastered thousands of years before we even had a name for it.
So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the history of this amazing teamwork. Then we'll meet the microscopic chefs who do all the work. After that, we'll break down exactly how they create beer, bread, and cheese. And finally, we'll see what this ancient science means for all of us, right in our own kitchens.
Okay, let's get into it. Our story kicks off thousands of years ago with what you could easily argue is humanity's most important partnership. And no, I'm not talking about dogs or horses. I'm talking about microbes.
I mean, the evidence we have is just incredible. We have records showing that as far back as 8000 BC, the Sumerians were brewing beer. And you got to understand, this wasn't just for a good time. For these early civilizations, this was actually a life-saving technology.
So why was it so important? Well, think about it. In a world where clean drinking water was incredibly rare and often full of nasty stuff, the local river could literally kill you. So fermented drinks were a total game changer. The fermentation process killed off harmful germs, making things like beer not just nutritious, but more importantly, safe to drink. For literally thousands of years, people were getting all these benefits without having the slightest clue who or what was actually doing all the hard work. So now it's time to pull out the microscope and meet these invisible chefs.
Check this out. On the left, you're seeing one of the very first drawings ever made of yeast cells. And on the right, that's what we see today with a modern microscope. These tiny, single-celled fungi. They are the absolute powerhouses behind this whole story.
So the process they use is called fermentation. And it's actually pretty simple when you break it down. Basically, these tiny organisms eat carbohydrates, things like sugars from grain or fruit. And as they eat, they produce byproducts. In this case, those byproducts are alcohol, acids, and gas. That's it.
Of course, we can't talk about this without tipping our hats to the great Louis Pasteur. It really wasn't until his work in the 1800s that we finally understood that these microscopic forces were behind everything. He's the guy who took this ancient craft from being a sort of happy accident and turned it into a real intentional science. Okay, so let's jump into our first case study. Let's see exactly how these unseen chefs whip up one of the world's oldest and most popular drinks, beer.
Now this diagram of a modern brewery, it might look a little intense, but don't worry about it. The basic principles at work here have been exactly the same for thousands of years. It's all about creating the perfect buffet for our little microbial friends to feast on.
And it really all boils down to these 4 key steps. First, you've got malting. That's where you trick barley into sprouting, which creates enzymes. Think of them like tiny molecular scissors that chop up starches into simple sugars. Next is mashing, which creates a sugary liquid called wort. Third, and this is the magic part, fermenting. You add the yeast and just let it go to town. And finally, maturing, where the beer just sits and develops all its complex flavors.
This whole process is so revered that in some places it's literally the law. The famous German purity law of 1516. It says that real beer can only have 4 things in it: water, malt, hops, and yeast. That's it. And that's been the rule for over 500 years. How cool is that?
All right, let's move on to our next example and see how pretty much the same principles create something totally different, but just as amazing: bread. And we're going to get specific and look at the wonderfully complex world of sourdough.
Sourdough is just fascinating because it's not just one microbe doing the job. It's a stable biological partnership. It's a perfect example of symbiosis, a living community, happening right there on your countertop. Inside a sourdough starter, you've got a whole team working together. You have yeast, which produces carbon dioxide gas. That gas gets trapped in the dough, and that's what makes the bread rise. But at the exact same time, you have special bacteria, and I love this. They're called Lactobacillus san franciscensis, and they produce lactic acid, which gives the bread that iconic sour tang. And here's the best part. The acid from the bacteria actually protects the yeast from other microbes. It's a perfect partnership.
Okay, for our final case study, let's look at how another kind of microbial alliance can take a simple liquid, milk, and turn it into the hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of cheese we have today.
The basic idea is always kind of the same. You start with milk, you add some specific starter cultures, bacteria or mold, and then you add an enzyme called rennet to make it curdle. That separates the solid curds from the liquid whey. From there, the curds are shaped, salted, and stored, and you just let the microbes do their thing for weeks, months, or sometimes even years.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Different microbes create totally different cheeses. So take Swiss cheese, right? Those famous holes? They're not drilled in there. They're literally bubbles of carbon dioxide gas produced by a specific bacterium that also happens to create the cheese's nutty, sweet flavor. It's biology you can actually see and taste.
So after our little tour through breweries and bakeries and cheese caves, let's bring it all back home and see what this ancient science really means for us right now.
For nearly 10,000 years, humans have been practicing biotechnology without even knowing what it was called. We've been using living organisms to make our food safer, more nutritious, and of course, a whole lot more delicious.
But here's the crucial point. This ancient science is far from over. In fact, it's still evolving. Today, scientists can pick and choose and even engineer specific microbial strains to get more reliable results or to fine-tune the flavors of our favorite foods in ways we never ever could before.
And that just brilliantly illustrates the power of biotechnology. It all started as this happy accident that gave us some of our most iconic foods. And that leaves us with one final, fascinating thought to chew on. If this is what we managed to achieve just by accident, imagine what we can do now on purpose.